Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video is going to be a more general fermentation and, in particular, Koji related update. Before I get into the Koji related projects, I do want to do one more big push for my fermentation related Kickstarter. That project is about purchasing a recently isolated species of yeast that has some interesting properties when used for fermentation. You can find out all the details in the first link in the video description. It's a really modest, small scale project, but I think it will result in some interesting videos. Now, getting back to the other projects. Nearly 8 months ago now, we got a delivery of pretty good local grass-fed beef. Some of that beef went into dry aging projects, but for various reasons, some of the pieces were a little small because the animal needed to be slaughtered early. In addition to the dry aging, one of the projects I did was turning the Eye of Round into a beef garum. The original meaning of garum was an ancient Roman form of fish sauce, but in this context refers to a Koji assisted protein based sauce. I was basing my proportions from the beef garum in the Noma Guide to Fermentation, but I did make some little adjustments. I was using a batch of barley koji I had made, but I wasn't entirely happy with the koji growth at the time. So, relative to the recipe in the guide to fermentation, I did increase the proportion of koji barley. Based on the color that resulted after 8 months, I was in fact correct that the koji wasn't great. The color should have been much darker from enzymatic breakdown. The extra barley I used also made the final processing and filtering difficult, so my actual final yield was quite low. Flavor was actually decent, a generic, pleasant, savory, salty, sweet combination, not as distinctly beefy as I was hoping, although it does smell quite pleasant when being cooked, and I saved all of the solids and sludge that made filtering difficult. I'm using all of those solids and a little extra rice koji from the freezer as a koji pickling setup. So far, I did the Kojizuke with some already roasted beets, and the results were pretty delicious. But given the results of the actual garum sauce, I would say overall this project is a relative failure. For now, though, let's move on to another Koji project that was a bit more of a success. Close to a year ago now, I made a burnt bread miso. Once again, a modified recipe from the Noma Guide. In their recipe, you grow koji directly onto pieces of bread, and then you ferment that with salt like a miso. I did that, except before adding the koji, I toasted most of the bread and also intentionally burnt a small portion of it. My final miso mixture also contained a little bit of regular koji rice because I had extra at the time. That miso was initially aged inside a crock, and after close to 6 months, I decanted it. I processed the miso a little bit. A jar went into the fridge for everyday use, but the rest of it got transferred into vacuum bags to continue aging. I was really quite happy with the results, but I really wasn't using the miso very much. There was a really lovely complex flavor profile, but it didn't work with everything. So I decided to take all of the extra miso that had continued aging and process it into tamari. One of the techniques from the Guide to Fermentation for maximizing tamari yield is blending miso with a large amount of water and then going through a freeze-thaw cycle. Once you have a diluted, clear tamari, you then reduce it on the stove to get your final product. I'm sure it's a good technique, but I'm fortunate enough to have a centrifuge, so, so I thought I would utilize that. I was able to blend the miso with much less water, roughly a 3-to-1 ratio of water to miso, versus the original technique, which called for close to 7-to-1. I then kept processing batches of the miso puree until I had a few liters of somewhat diluted tamari, and, of course, saved the solids. The solids once again went into my koji pickling setup, and the tamari was reduced in a double boiler. Once I was happy with the flavor in terms of reduction, I did also cheat a little bit to attempt a nicer texture. Based on the weight of the final tamari, I added roughly 4% dextrose and a little over 0.1% xanthan gum. I'm still not entirely sure if I'm happy with the texture, but it's something I'll play around with more in the future. But the flavor is really nice. It tastes like a nice, good quality shoyu, maybe slightly sweeter than average, but with a definite, distinct flavor of toasted bread on the finish. But that is pretty much it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, please consider checking out the Kickstarter in the video description. If you have any other questions about Koji or fermentation in general, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.